August of 2020, 8 years. That is how much time remained on a contract Nike had just decided to tear up. 15 years of partnership with a single athlete ended not with a celebration, not with a retirement tour, but with a statement so carefully worded it revealed nothing at first glance. The Wall Street Journal would later report the timeline, the investigation, the refusal to cooperate. But the story of that contract, the one that nearly ended an athlete empire, began much earlier than any public statement. In 2016, a marketing event brought together one of the world's most valuable athletes and a team of Nike employees. The details of what happened remain contested, but the investigation that followed changed the trajectory of both parties. By the time the contract was terminated, the damage was already baked into the structure of the deal itself. And that structure, the hidden mechanism, is what nearly ended everything. You probably remember the headlines from August 2020. Nike said Neymar was no longer a Nike athlete. The New York Times reported that the long partnership had lasted 15 years before ending unexpectedly. The ESPN coverage noted that Nike cited the athlete's refusal to cooperate in a good faith investigation of credible allegations of wrongdoing by an employee. But the contract itself was the silent actor in the story. It contained a clause that gave Nike an exit, but also a vulnerability that no one saw coming. The room where the original deal was negotiated is now forgotten. The lawyers who drafted the contract have moved on. But the mechanism they built, the one that seemed to protect the company, almost collapsed the empire from within, because the clause that ended the partnership was never designed to be used. It was designed as a threat that no one thought would ever be executed, and when it was used, the shockwaves traveled through every corner of Nike's athlete empire. This is not a story about one athlete's behavior. It is a story about what happens when a contract becomes a weapon instead of a shield, when the structure you built to protect yourself turns into the very thing that weakens you. The quants of the sports marketing world, the analysts who model endorsement value, never saw this coming because they were looking at the wrong data. They were looking at market share, at jersey sales, at social media engagement. They were not looking at the contract's deepest assumptions. And those assumptions were about to be tested in a way that revealed the empire's most fragile point, the point where control becomes liability, the point where the mechanism you trusted becomes the mechanism that breaks you. Think about what that means for every institution that operates on leverage, every company that builds its empire on contracts designed to concentrate power. The assumption is always the same. We control the terms, we control the outcome. But the outcome is never controlled by the terms. It is controlled by what the terms do not say. The gaps, the silences, the mechanisms that only reveal themselves under pressure. When Nike's legal team drafted the contract with Neymar, they inserted what seemed like standard protection. Cooperation clauses are common in athlete endorsement deals. They give the sponsor the right to terminate if the athlete engages in behavior that damages the brand. But this clause had a hidden edge. It required cooperation not just with public relations, but with internal investigations. And that requirement, that one specific phrase, would become the hinge on which the entire deal turned. The allegation that triggered the investigation came from a female Nike employee. The event was a marketing activation in 2016. Neymar was 24 years old at the time. At the peak of his global marketability, the investigation was opened, and then the contract did something unexpected. It forced a choice that no one involved wanted to make. Here's where the mechanism reveals itself. The cooperation clause did not just give Nike the right to investigate, it required the athlete to cooperate. And the refusal to cooperate, according to Nike's public statements, is what triggered the termination. But think about what cooperation means in this context. It means submitting to an investigation conducted by the same company that pays your salary, the same company that holds the leverage, the same company that issued the statement citing the refusal. That asymmetry you just felt, the empire building its own trap and calling it safety. That mechanism repeats across markets, institutions, every system designed to look fair. If you want to keep seeing through the structure before the crowd catches up, subscribe. And drop the word refusal in the comments if you suspect that silence is the only move the underdog really has. The asymmetry is staggering, and yet the clause was drafted to look like standard protection. The empire built its own trap and called it safety. This is the pattern that repeats across every institutional framework. The mechanism that seems to protect the powerful is the mechanism that eventually constrains them, because power always assumes the other side will submit. Power never accounts for the moment when the other side refuses. Neymar's refusal, whatever its motivations, exposed the clause's hidden weakness. The clause was designed to terminate the deal quickly and quietly, but the mechanism of termination created a public controversy that no one had anticipated. The Wall Street Journal reported in May of 2021 that Nike did not disclose the specific reasons for the termination in August of 2020. The silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured speculation, accusations, and a narrative that neither side could control. The contract that was supposed to protect the brand became the source of its most damaging exposure, and that exposure rippled through Nike's entire athlete portfolio. Every existing contract was now under a new kind of scrutiny. Every clause looked different in the light of that termination. The empire had assumed it was invulnerable. The contract revealed it was not. Now consider what the analysts missed. The models that valued Neymar's endorsement did not include a variable for investigation cooperation. They did not include a variable for the public relations fallout of a termination mid-contract. They optimized for everything except the one thing that actually mattered, and that is exactly what happens when you build a model that assumes control. You optimize for the known variables. You ignore the unknown ones, and the unknown ones are always the ones that break you. The financial impact of the termination is still being calculated. The 8 remaining years of the deal represented hundreds of millions of dollars in projected revenue. But the real cost was not the lost revenue. The real cost was the precedent. The real cost was the signal that Nike would terminate an athlete contract over internal investigation cooperation. That signal changed the negotiating dynamics for every athlete considering a Nike deal, and in the long arc of the empire, that shift in leverage was far more dangerous than any single contract. Here is where the story deepens. The contract that nearly ended the empire was not an outlier. It was a template. The same clause, the same structure, appeared in dozens of other endorsement deals. The same assumptions about control and cooperation were baked into the DNA of the company's athlete relationships. And when that template cracked, the entire structure became vulnerable. But the athlete side saw something the institution missed. They saw that the clause was a double-edged sword. If Nike could terminate for non-cooperation, the athlete could also use that very mechanism as a bargaining chip. The threat of non-cooperation became leverage. The contract that was designed to concentrate power actually distributed it, and the empire did not realize it until it was too late. This is the inversion that the underdog always sees, and the institution never does. The contract is not fixed. It is a relationship that both sides interpret. The empire sees its clauses as constraints on the other party. The athlete sees them as constraints on the empire. Both are right, and the one who understands that first wins. Nike's legal team understood contract law. They did not understand the psychology of the contract. They did not understand that the moment an athlete refuses to cooperate, the cooperation clause becomes a weapon in the athlete's hands, because the public fight over the clause damages the brand far more than the investigation itself, and the brand is the only thing the empire cannot afford to lose. The Wall Street Journal article that broke the story in May of 2021 was titled, "Nike Split with Neymar Amid Sexual Assault Probe." The article revealed that the contract still had 8 years left. The New York Times added the 15-year timeline. ESPN quoted Nike's exact statement, and in each telling of the story, the contract was the silent third party, the mechanism that made the split possible, the mechanism that made the split inevitable. But the most important detail is the one that goes almost unmentioned. The cooperation clause did not just end the deal. It created a legal and reputational gray area that benefited neither party. Nike's statement cited a refusal to cooperate in a good faith investigation of credible allegations, but the refusal itself, without a public determination of the allegations' validity, left the story unresolved. And unresolved stories are the worst possible outcome for a global brand. The contract that was supposed to provide clarity created ambiguity. The mechanism that was supposed to protect reputation damaged it, and the empire, built over decades on a foundation of carefully managed relationships, discovered that a single clause in a single contract could destabilize the entire structure. Now think about what this means for your own framework. Every system you trust to protect you is built on assumptions. Every contract you sign contains a mechanism you have not fully analyzed. The institution that seems invulnerable is held together by clauses that only reveal their true nature under the pressure of an unexpected event. And that unexpected event is always the one the modelers did not see. The analysts who studied Neymar's endorsement value never ran a scenario for this. The models that predicted jersey sales and social media engagement did not include a variable for internal investigation cooperation. They optimized for the market. They did not optimize for the contract. And the contract, not the market, is what ended the partnership. Every contract you trust contains a clause you have not stress tested, and that clause will only reveal itself at the worst possible moment. If you want to stay ahead of the system before it breaks you, subscribe so you keep seeing where the next hidden fault line is buried. Drop a specific clause or assumption you suspect is quietly undermining your own edge in the comments. Let's map the blind spots together. This is the lesson that the underdog learns again and again. The institution's power is concentrated in its systems, but those systems are only as strong as their weakest assumption. And the weakest assumption is always about control. The institution assumes it controls the terms. The institution assumes it controls the narrative. The institution assumes it can execute the clause without blowback. Every assumption is wrong. Neymar's camp, whatever else one might say about their strategy, understood something that Nike's legal team did not. They understood that the cooperation clause was a trap for both sides, and that the side that could withstand the trap's fallout would determine the narrative. Neymar did not cooperate. Nike terminated, and then the public fight began. A fight that neither side could win, but that both sides had to fight. The contract that nearly ended Nike's athlete empire was not the Neymar contract. It was every contract that contained that clause. The empire discovered that its template was a liability, and the discovery came too late to prevent the damage. But here's the part that changes everything. The contract that nearly ended the empire was also the contract that revealed its most dangerous blind spot. The empire assumed the clause was a weapon it held. The empire did not realize that every weapon held against another party is also a weapon that can be used on the holder. The contract does not protect, it constrains both sides equally. And the side that understands the constraint first has the advantage. You have felt this in your own life. The agreement that seemed to favor you, the clause that seemed to protect you, the structure that seemed to guarantee your control, and then the moment when the other side refused to play by the rules you assumed were fixed. The moment when the mechanism you trusted turned against you. The moment when you realized the contract was not a shield, but a cage. That moment is what the institution fears most, and that moment is what the underdog lives for. Because the underdog knows that the contract is not the relationship. The contract is just the record of assumptions, and assumptions can be broken. Neymar's team saw the leverage shift. That is the underdog insight the institution never models. The cooperation clause was a mechanism for control, but control in a public relationship is always reciprocal. When Nike triggered the investigation, they triggered their own vulnerability. The athlete's refusal was not a failure to comply. It was a tactical choice, one that forced Nike into a position where every move would be scrutinized. Think about the sequence. The employee's allegations came to light. Nike launched an investigation. The athlete was asked to participate. He declined. Nike terminated the contract. But here's what the empire did not anticipate. The termination itself became the story. It was no longer about the allegations. It was about the process, and the process was controlled by the very clause Nike had written. The public discourse shifted immediately. Reporters began questioning the fairness of an investigation conducted by one party against another. The New York Times noted the unusual nature of the termination. ESPN asked why a multi-billion-dollar company would end a partnership over a procedural issue. The clause was designed to avoid a public spectacle. Instead, it created one. And in that spectacle, the athlete gained a new kind of power. He could not control Nike's termination decision, but he could control his response. He could choose silence. He could choose to let the contract speak for itself. And silence in the context of a public dispute is a strategy that institutions rarely master. The empire is built on communication, on messaging, on controlling the narrative. The underdog is built on waiting. The underdog knows that the loudest voice is not always the most effective. Nike issued statements. The athletes' camp stayed quiet. The story was driven by leaks and speculation. Each new article placed the cooperation clause under a microscope.
It directly challenges
Legal
the
analysts
previous
debated
testimony.
whether Nike
This could
acted
change
appropriately.
everything.
The Wall Street Journal obtained internal documents that showed the investigation was opened in 2019, a year before the termination. The timeline suggested that Nike had known about the allegations for months before acting, and that delay, combined with the athletes' refusal, created a narrative of procedural confusion. The empire found itself in a position it rarely occupies. It was defending its own decision-making process. It was trying to convince the public that a termination over cooperation was justified. But justification is a losing game when the standards are unverifiable. Nike could not prove the athlete violated the clause without the athlete's cooperation, and the athlete would not cooperate. The trap closed on both sides. Now compare this to the institutional models that valued athlete endorsements. Those models assumed every contract was executable. They assumed every clause would work as written. They did not account for the human element, the refusal, the silence, the strategy of non-engagement. The analysts optimized for the market. They did not optimize for the relationship, and the relationship, as it turned out, was the variable that mattered most. The lesson extends beyond sports endorsements. Every institution that operates through contracts faces this same blind spot. The clause is not a mechanism. It is a negotiation that continues long after the ink dries. The athlete who refuses to cooperate is not breaking the contract. He is rewriting it in real time. He is showing that the text on the page is only one part of the agreement. The other part is the real world, the public sphere, the unpredictable consequences of execution. Nike's legal team understood the first part. They did not understand the second, and that failure of understanding is what nearly ended the athlete empire. Because the empire's value is not in its contracts. It is in its relationships. And relationships cannot be controlled through termination clauses. They can only be damaged. The financial numbers tell part of the story. Neymar's endorsement deal with Nike was valued at over $100 million over 15 years. The remaining 8 years represented a significant revenue stream, but the cost of the termination went far beyond the lost marketing value. The real cost was measured in trust. Every athlete watching the Neymar situation made a calculation. They saw that Nike would terminate a contract over procedural non-compliance. They saw that the clause could be used at any time, for any reason, as long as the company framed it as a good faith investigation. That calculation shifted the leverage in every future negotiation. Athletes began to ask for protections against unilateral termination. Their agents added language requiring independent investigation if allegations arose. The clause that was supposed to strengthen the empire weakened it. The template was now a liability, and the empire could not renegotiate every contract simultaneously. This is the cascade effect that the institution never sees. One clause, one termination, one refusal, and the entire structure begins to crack. Not because the athlete was powerful, but because the clause was fragile. The fragility was always there. The institution just never tested it. The underdog did. Think about what Neymar's camp knew that Nike's legal team did not. They knew that a public fight over a cooperation clause would damage the brand more than the allegations themselves. They knew that Nike's interest was in minimizing exposure, and they knew that by refusing to cooperate, they could force Nike into a choice between execution and silence. Either the company executed the clause and took the public hit, or it backed down and lost credibility. The institution had no good options. The underdog had no bad ones. The refusal was not an act of defiance. It was an act of strategy. The athletes' team understood that the clause was never about justice. It was about control. And control, in a relationship between a global brand and a single athlete, is a game of who can endure the most public scrutiny. Nike could not endure it. The athlete could. The athlete could endure the scrutiny because they understood something the institution never will, that the most powerful leverage is knowing exactly which clause the other side cannot afford to execute. If you want to keep spotting these fractures before the market does, subscribe, because the next reversal is always hiding in a document the suits think they wrote. Drop fragile clause in the comments if you've watched this same pattern play out in your own positions. And that is exactly what the WSJ uncovered next. The Wall Street Journal's investigation showed that the internal process was flawed from the start. Nike opened the investigation in 2019. The athlete was notified. The allegations were described as credible, but credible in the context of a company investigating its own endorser is a term with no fixed meaning. It means whatever the company needs it to mean, and the athletes' camp knew that. They knew that cooperating with an investigation whose standards were unverifiable was a loss in every scenario. If they cooperated, they submitted to a process they did not control. If they refused, they faced termination but gained the narrative. They chose the narrative, and that choice is the moment every underdog recognizes, the moment when the system seems to offer only bad options, the moment when the contract appears to have all the power, and the moment when you realize that the system's power is not in the clause, it is in your willingness to follow the clause. If you refuse, the system must respond, and its response is always slower, clumsier, and more damaging to itself than to you. This is the inversion at the heart of every asymmetrical relationship. The institution builds its power on the assumption that the other side will follow the rules. The underdog builds its power on the assumption that the rules are optional, not illegal, not unethical, optional, because the institution cannot enforce a rule that the underdog refuses to acknowledge. The contract is a piece of paper. The relationship is everything else. Nike's athlete empire was nearly ended by a piece of paper. 15 years of partnership, hundreds of millions in revenue, a global marketing machine, all built on the assumption that a cooperation clause would never be tested. It was tested. It failed. And the failure revealed that the empire was not made of contracts. It was made of willingness, the willingness of athletes to sign, the willingness of athletes to follow. And when the willingness stopped, the empire had nothing to hold on to. The analysts who study institutional failure will look at the numbers. They will ask about the lost revenue, the precedent, the shift in negotiating leverage. But the deeper truth is simpler. The contract that nearly ended Nike's athlete empire was the one that forced a public choice. And in that choice, the institution lost a battle it did not know it was fighting. The underdog won by not fighting, by refusing to engage on the institution's terms, by letting the institution execute a clause that damaged itself more than it damaged the athlete. That is the quiet edge, the edge that no model can capture, no algorithm can predict, no analyst can quantify. It is the edge of understanding that the system is not as strong as it appears. It is only as strong as your willingness to follow its rules. And when you refuse, the system reveals itself for what it is, a collection of assumptions, a fragile structure held together by agreement. An agreement can be withdrawn at any time. That is the quiet edge, the edge that no model can capture, no algorithm can predict, no analyst can quantify. It is the edge of understanding that the system is not as strong as it appears. It is only as strong as your willingness to follow its rules. And when you refuse, the system reveals itself for what it is, a collection of assumptions, a fragile structure held together by agreement. An agreement can be withdrawn at any time. The clause that nearly ended the empire was never the Neymar clause. It was the assumption that the clause would never be tested. Nike built a mechanism for control and assumed the athlete would always comply. The athlete did not. And the mechanism designed to protect the brand became the instrument of its most public wound. The empire learned something in that moment. It learned that control is an illusion. It is a story you tell yourself until someone refuses to cooperate. The contract is still there. It sits in a filing system somewhere in Beaverton, Oregon. The pages are yellowing. The ink is fading. The signatures are still legible, but the power the contract promised is gone. It evaporated the moment the athlete refused. And that refusal, that single decision, is the only real power anyone in any relationship ever has. You do not need a billion-dollar endorsement deal to understand this. You only need one document, one signature, one moment when you decide that the terms are not binding because the relationship is more important than the contract. The empire built its strength on paper. The underdog built its strength on the willingness to walk away. And in that difference, the entire balance of power is determined.